There's a lake in Russia that will kill you. Not in the way that a deep lake might drown you, or a cold lake might take your heat, or a lake with a dangerous current might pull you under. Those are the ordinary dangers of water, and they require contact, immersion, a mistake. This lake requires nothing like that. This lake will kill you simply for standing near it. 1 hour on the shore is enough to receive a fatal radiation dose. Not enough to feel immediate symptoms, not enough to collapse on the spot, but enough to have received the kind of cellular damage that will, over the following days and weeks, dismantle the body from the inside, killing bone marrow, destroying the gut lining, and delivering a verdict that modern medicine cannot reverse. The lake is called Lake Karachay, and it sits in the southern Ural Mountains of Russia, in a region that was, for decades, one of the most heavily guarded and most thoroughly denied places on Earth. It does not appear on maps from the Soviet era. The city nearest to it did not officially exist. The people who lived and worked beside it were not told what was being done to the water, or to them. And when they began to die in unusual numbers, the cause was attributed to other things. Welcome to Sleepy Science Stories. Tonight we are going somewhere you cannot visit, to a place that has been described by environmental scientists as the most contaminated spot on Earth, to a body of water that holds more radioactive material than was released by the Chernobyl disaster, and to a story about what happens when industrial power operates without accountability, when secrecy becomes more important than human life, and when the Karnin generations that had no part in making them. The story of Lake Karachay begins with a bomb. It moves through a secret city, a catastrophic explosion, a lethal wind, and decades of lies. It ends at the bottom of a lake that has been filled with concrete and hollow blocks, not cleaned, not remediated, simply sealed, pressed down, and left for the future to worry about. Let your breathing slow. Let the room settle around you. What you are about to hear is not science fiction, and not history that has been safely resolved. It is the story of a place that still exists, a contamination that is still spreading, and a legacy of the Cold War that no one has fully figured out how to undo. Tonight we will go through the whole story, from the bomb that required the lake, to the people who were poisoned by it, to the scientists who exposed what had been hidden, to the concrete lid that now sits over what no one knows how to remove. It is a story about what industrial secrecy looks like when it is total and maintained for decades, and about what happens to human beings when they are treated as secondary to the imperatives of the state. The lake is still there. The contamination is still spreading, and the world that contains it is the same world you are sleeping in tonight. What makes this story worth sitting with, in the dark, in the quiet of a night that feels safe and ordinary, is not the scale of the catastrophe, though the scale is extraordinary. It is the ordinariness of the people at its center, workers who went to a job, villagers who drank from a river, scientists who measured what they found and wrote it in records that would not be seen for decades. It is a story about human institutions and what they do when accountability is removed, and about how long the consequences of those choices last. Understanding it does not require any specialized knowledge. It requires only the willingness to look at what happened, steadily and without looking away. Lake Karachay is a small lake, as lakes go, covering less than a square kilometer at its largest extent, sitting in a shallow depression in the eastern foothills of the Ural Mountains, in Chelyabinsk Oblast in what is now the Russian Federation. It is not a naturally remarkable body of water. There is nothing in its geology, its position, or its hydrology that would distinguish it from thousands of other small lakes scattered across the vast interior of Russia. What makes Lake Karachay what it is has nothing to do with nature and everything to do with a decision made in the late 1940s, a decision about where to dispose of the most dangerous waste products of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. And the answer, selected for reasons of convenience and concealment rather than safety, was this unremarkable little lake in the Ural foothills. Over the decades that followed, Lake Karachay received an accumulation of radioactive material that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Estimates of the total radioactivity in the lake and its sediments vary, but figures in the range of 4 to 5 exabecquerels have been cited in the scientific literature, a unit of measurement so large that it requires context to make any sense at all. The Chernobyl disaster, the most famous nuclear accident in history, released approximately 1 exabecquerel of radioactivity into the environment. Lake Karachay contains the equivalent of 4 to 5 Chernobyls, concentrated in a body of water smaller than many city parks. The radioactivity is not distributed evenly. It is concentrated in the lake sediments, which have accumulated decades of deposited waste, and in the shallow waters near the inlet pipes that once delivered the waste directly from the Mayak production facility a few kilometers away. The most intensely contaminated sediments contain strontium-90 and cesium-137 in concentrations that produce radiation fields of hundreds of roentgens per hour at the surface, a figure that makes the 1-hour lethal dose estimate not just plausible but conservative. To understand how this happened, and why it was allowed to continue for as long as it did, it is necessary to understand what Lake Karachay was created to serve, and what the Mayak facility was, and why it was built where it was, and who knew what was happening there, and who decided that knowledge was too dangerous to share. The answer to most of those questions traces back to the summer of 1945, to the white heat of 2 explosions over Japan, and to the decision by the Soviet Union that it needed, as quickly as possible, to have what the United States had just demonstrated. But before we follow that thread, it is worth pausing on the lake itself, on what it means for a body of water to become what Lake Karachay has become. Lakes are among the most permanent features of a landscape. They outlast the human lives spent beside them, outlast the settlements that grow on their shores, outlast the civilizations that form and dissolve around them. The idea that a lake could be destroyed, not by draining or by filling in the ordinary sense, but by being converted into something toxic beyond human capacity to remedy, is one that requires a moment to absorb. Lake Karachay was not always what it is. It was made what it is, deliberately, by human decisions, and those decisions have committed it to a condition that will persist for generations beyond anyone now alive. The lake sits in the Chelyabinsk region, a part of Russia that most people outside the country could not locate on a map, and that was, for most of the second half of the 20th century, one of the most closely guarded regions in the world. The secrecy that protected the Mayak facility also protected knowledge of what the facility was doing to the land around it. And for decades, the outside world had no reliable information about conditions in the area. What information eventually emerged came through the work of individual scientists who risked their careers and their freedom to document what was happening, and through the partial opening of Soviet archives that began in the late 1980s. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, killed somewhere between 120,000 and 220,000 people, depending on estimates of the longer-term radiation deaths. They ended the Second World War in the Pacific, and they began something else entirely. A race between the United States and the Soviet Union to determine who would control the most destructive technology in human history. Joseph Stalin was informed of the Hiroshima bombing within hours. His response was not panic but cold determination. The Soviet atomic bomb program, which had been running since 1943 with intelligence assistance from spies within the Manhattan Project, was immediately accelerated, given essentially unlimited resources, and placed under the personal direction of Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, and one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union. The pressure was extreme in every sense. Scientific teams worked in conditions of total secrecy. Personnel who made mistakes or failed to meet targets faced consequences that went far beyond professional censure. The entire apparatus of Soviet state power was placed behind the project, and corners that would have been unthinkable to cut in a peacetime industrial program were cut without hesitation, because the goal was speed, and speed meant accepting risks that would have been unacceptable in any other context. The first Soviet atomic bomb test, called First Lightning, was conducted on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, ending the American nuclear monopoly and beginning the Cold War in its most dangerous phase. The 4 years between the end of the Second World War and that test had been years of extraordinary exertion by Soviet scientists, engineers, and workers, and the facility at the heart of that effort was the one that would later poison Lake Karachay. The knowledge that a nuclear weapon requires not just scientific understanding, but industrial production capacity at enormous scale was one of the central lessons of the Manhattan Project, and the Soviets understood it clearly. Building a bomb meant building factories, and factories meant locations, and locations meant choices about where to site the most hazardous industrial operations in human history in a way that was hidden from American surveillance and accessible to Soviet supply chains. The Ural Mountains were the answer. Far from the western borders where American observation was most likely, connected to the rest of the Soviet Union by rail, and isolated enough that the workers and communities around the facility could be controlled and their stories suppressed, the southern Urals offered the combination of remoteness and infrastructure that the program required. And so a city was built there, a city that did not appear on maps, a city whose existence was a state secret, a city called Chelyabinsk 40, later renamed Ozyorsk. The urgency of the Soviet program in these years is difficult to overstate. Stalin regarded the American nuclear monopoly as an existential threat, and Beria drove the program with the methods of the security apparatus he ran, rewarding success with privileges and threatening failure with consequences that no scientist or engineer could afford to contemplate. The result was a program that produced results faster than almost anyone outside the Soviet Union believed possible, and that produced, as a byproduct, a pattern of corner cutting and concealment that would shape the legacy of the Mayak facility for decades to come. The scientists who worked on the Soviet atomic program were, in many cases, brilliant and dedicated, people who understood the physics of what they were building and the chemistry of what they were producing, and the biology of what their waste streams would do to living things. They were not ignorant of the consequences of their work. They operated within an institutional context in which those consequences were classified as secondary to the imperatives of the program, and in which objecting to that ordering of priorities was not a realistic option. The decisions that made Lake Karachay what it became were not made by monsters in any simple sense. They were made by human beings operating under pressure, within a system that had removed the mechanisms by which the costs of those decisions might have been weighed against the benefits. The facility built in the southern Urals was given the name Mayak, which means lighthouse in Russian, a name chosen with an irony that must have been unintentional, since the facility was designed to be invisible rather than illuminating. Construction began in 1945, and the pace was driven by the pressure of the weapons program and the particular style of Soviet industrial mobilization, which meant that enormous numbers of workers were brought in, many of them prisoners from the Gulag system, and pushed to build at speeds that normal engineering practice would have considered reckless. The facility was designed to produce plutonium, the fissile material required for implosion-type nuclear weapons of the kind the Americans had used at Nagasaki. Plutonium production requires a nuclear reactor to irradiate uranium, and then a series of chemical separation processes to extract the plutonium from the irradiated fuel, and those chemical processes produce large volumes of intensely radioactive liquid waste, because the separation chemistry is wet, requiring acids and solvents that carry the radioactive contaminants out of the solid fuel and into solution. The question of what to do with that liquid waste is not a trivial one. It cannot be neutralized by chemical treatment, because radioactivity is a nuclear property rather than a chemical one, and no chemical process changes the rate at which radioactive atoms decay. The waste simply has to be stored somewhere until the radioactive isotopes it contains decay to safe levels. And many of the isotopes in nuclear production waste have half-lives of decades to centuries, meaning that safe storage is not a matter of years, but of lifetimes, of geological timeframes that strain the concept of management to its limit. The Mayak facility, operating under the pressure of the weapons program and the particular institutional culture of the early Soviet nuclear establishment, chose the simplest and most expedient solution available. The liquid waste was piped to the nearest convenient body of water, and Lake Karachay, small and isolated and hidden in the landscape, was that body of water. The city of Ozyorsk, built to house the workers and scientists of Mayak, was a closed city, meaning that residents required special permission to enter or leave, that correspondence was monitored, that visitors from outside were essentially impossible, and that the activities of the facility were protected by layers of secrecy that extended to the families of workers. People who lived in Ozyorsk knew they worked on something important and secret. Many did not know, at least not at first, exactly what was being put into the lake a few kilometers from their homes. The closed city had its compensations. By Soviet standards, Ozyorsk was well supplied, its residents given access to food, goods, and services that were scarce in the rest of the country. This was a deliberate policy, designed to attract and retain the technical personnel the program needed, and to compensate them for the constraints on their freedom. But the compensation did not include the most important thing: honest information about what they were being exposed to. The workers who built the facility, many of them prisoners from the Gulag system with no choice about where they were sent or what they were required to do, received no such compensations at all. They were assigned to the most physically demanding and most hazardous construction work, given minimal protective equipment, and exposed to radiation levels that were recognized as dangerous by the scientists and engineers who directed the project. When the construction phase ended, survivors were dispersed back into the general population or the prison system, their health outcomes never tracked, their exposures never quantified, their contribution to the Soviet nuclear program unacknowledged in any official record. The waste dumping into Lake Karachay began in 1951, and it continued with only partial interruptions for decades. The primary isotopes deposited in the lake were strontium-90 and cesium-137, both fission products of the uranium and plutonium reactions in the Mayak reactors, and both intensely dangerous to biological tissue. Strontium-90 is particularly insidious because it is chemically similar to calcium, which means the body processes it as if it were calcium, incorporating it into bone tissue and into the bone marrow where blood cells are produced. Once strontium-90 is deposited in bone, it irradiates the surrounding tissue continuously from the inside, at close range, for years, because its half-life is approximately 29 years, meaning that a deposit of strontium-90 in bone tissue will still be delivering half its original radiation dose nearly 3 decades after it was absorbed. The cancers it most commonly produces are leukemia and bone cancer, both of which were found in elevated rates in the populations around Mayak for decades. Cesium-137 behaves differently in the body, distributing through soft tissues rather than bone, and it has a half-life of approximately 30 years as well, delivering radiation from wherever it deposits in the body for a comparable period. It was released in enormous quantities by the Chernobyl disaster, and the contamination of agricultural land and food supplies around Chernobyl with cesium-137 is still monitored today, nearly 40 years after the accident. In the early years of the dumping, the quantities were manageable relative to the lake's volume, though the practice was hazardous from the beginning. As the weapons program expanded through the 1950s, the volumes of waste increased, and the concentration of radioactivity in the lake's water and sediments grew progressively more extreme. Workers who had contact with the lake, or who worked in facilities near it, were receiving radiation doses that, had they been quantified and disclosed, would have been recognized as dangerous. Many were not quantified, and the results of dosimetry that was performed were treated as state secrets to which the workers themselves often had no access. The decision to use a natural lake as a radioactive waste dump, rather than constructing engineered containment facilities, was not made out of ignorance of the hazard. The scientists and engineers at MIAC understood radiation biology. They knew what the isotopes they were handling would do to living tissue. The decision was made because engineered containment would have taken time and resources that the weapons program was not willing to spare, and because the secrecy surrounding the facility meant that the normal mechanisms of regulatory oversight and public accountability that might have prevented such a decision did not apply. There was no one to say no, and the people who might have said no were the same people who were ordering the dumping. As the years passed and the waste volumes accumulated, the contamination of the lake grew beyond anything that its original designers had planned for or modeled. The concentration of radioactivity in the sediments increased year by year, and the lake became progressively more dangerous to approach, to touch, or to disturb. Each decision to continue the dumping made remediation more difficult and the eventual cost of management more extraordinary. The short-term convenience of a nearby lake as a waste disposal site was being purchased at a price that future generations would be required to pay without ever having agreed to the transaction. The isotopes deposited in Lake Karachay represent not just a chemical hazard, but a hazard measured in time. Strontium-90 has a half-life of 29 years, meaning that half of the atoms currently in the lake sediments will still be radioactive in 29 years, a quarter in 58 years, an eighth in 87 years. At this rate of decay, the most contaminated sediments will remain above safe levels for centuries, not decades. The people responsible for the facility in the 1950s made a decision whose consequences will extend to the 23rd century, to people who were not yet born, who had no voice in the decision, and who will inherit the obligation to manage what was left for them without adequate resources, adequate technology, or even adequate documentation of what was put into the ground. The health consequences of the MIAC operations began to manifest in the early 1950s, though the statistical patterns that would later make them undeniable were obscured for years by the secrecy surrounding the facility and by the systematic reassignment of radiation-related illness to other causes in official medical records. Workers at the facility were the first to be affected. Those involved in the chemical separation processes, which required handling intensely radioactive materials, received some of the highest occupational radiation doses ever recorded, and some of the earliest workers developed acute radiation syndrome, a cascade of organ failures caused by whole-body irradiation at high doses, within months of beginning their work. The condition was recognized and documented in internal medical records, but those records were classified, and the workers were told they were suffering from other conditions. The fishing villages along the Teka River, which flows from the MIAC area toward the north, began experiencing unusual illness patterns at roughly the same time as the radioactive waste from MIAC contaminated the river and the fish and water that the village populations depended on. Residents who drank directly from the river, as many did in the absence of other water sources, were ingesting strontium-90 and cesium-137 with every mouthful, and the isotopes were being incorporated into their bones and tissues, even as the Soviet state was denying that anything unusual was occurring in the region. The elevated rates of leukemia, bone cancer, and other radiation-associated diseases that began appearing in Teka River villages in the early 1950s were among the clearest signals available that the contamination was causing harm. But the signals were not acted on, because acting on them would have required acknowledging their cause, and acknowledging their cause would have meant admitting that the most important weapons program in the Soviet Union was poisoning the population that surrounded it. Instead, village residents were eventually evacuated from the most contaminated areas of the river, told only that they were being moved for unspecified reasons. and the houses they left behind were demolished to remove evidence of habitation. The contamination of the river continued. The evacuees were not given medical monitoring, were not told what they had been exposed to, and were not compensated for the displacement of their lives. The records of their health outcomes were placed under classification that would not be lifted for decades. The body count from the MIAC operations in this period is genuinely difficult to establish, both because of the deliberate suppression of records and because radiation-related illness manifests over years and decades, making it difficult to separate from background rates of cancer and other disease without careful epidemiological analysis. Studies conducted after the partial opening of Soviet archives in the 1980s and 90s have estimated that tens of thousands of people received significant radiation exposures from the MIAC operations in this period, and that the excess disease burden in affected populations is substantial, though the exact figures remain contested. What is not contested is the pattern of suffering that unfolded in communities that had no idea why their neighbors and family members were becoming sick in unusual numbers. The elevated rates of illness appeared gradually enough that they could be attributed to other causes, and the official medical system was structured to do exactly that, ensuring that radiation was never written on a death certificate as a contributing cause, no matter how clearly the clinical picture pointed toward it. The people who died in this period died without a truthful account of why, and their families were left to make sense of losses that the state had deliberately made impossible to explain. On September 29, 1957, a storage tank containing concentrated radioactive waste at the MIAC facility exploded. The explosion was not nuclear, in the sense that no chain reaction occurred, but it was catastrophic. The tank contained roughly 70 to 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste, primarily nitrate and acetate salts of long-lived isotopes, and the explosion, caused by a failure of the cooling system that maintained the tank's temperature, scattered approximately 20 million curies of radioactivity into the atmosphere over the surrounding landscape. The radioactive plume traveled northeast, driven by the prevailing winds, and deposited contamination across an area of about 20,000 square kilometers, covering portions of what are now the Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, and Tyumen regions of Russia. The most heavily contaminated zone, known as the Eastern Ural Radioactive Trace, had contamination levels comparable to those found in the most heavily affected areas around Chernobyl, a disaster that would not occur for another 3 decades. The Soviet response to the explosion was to conceal it. News was suppressed, and information about the accident did not reach the outside world until the 1970s, when a Soviet nuclear physicist named Georgy Medvedev, who had been exiled from the Soviet Union, published an account of what had happened based on information he had gathered from Soviet scientific literature, which contained oblique references to unusual ecological conditions in the Urals that he was able to interpret as evidence of a major accident. The Western nuclear establishment initially dismissed Medvedev's account. British and American nuclear officials publicly stated that the scale of contamination he described was implausible, that a disaster of the magnitude he was describing would have been impossible to conceal, and that his account was likely exaggerated or fabricated. They were wrong. When Soviet archives became partially accessible in the late 1980s, the accident was confirmed in detail, and the scale of contamination was found to be even larger than Medvedev had estimated. The name Kyshtym disaster comes from Kyshtym, the nearest city to MIAC that was actually marked on public maps, since Ozyorsk itself did not appear on maps at all. The disaster is officially classified as a Level 6 nuclear accident on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the second most severe category, exceeded only by Chernobyl and Fukushima, both of which are rated at Level 7. The Kyshtym disaster was, for more than 30 years, the worst nuclear accident in history, and almost no one in the world outside the Soviet Union knew it had happened. The affected population in the path of the radioactive plume included approximately 250,000 people, and the evacuation of the most contaminated communities was carried out over the months following the explosion, with the same pattern of secrecy and misdirection that characterized all the MIAC operations. Residents were told to leave their homes, were not told why, were not permitted to take livestock or food stores, and were relocated without explanation to places that were often hundreds of kilometers away. The experience of the Kishtim evacuees mirrors, in many respects, the experience of communities affected by other nuclear disasters, and it anticipates by nearly 30 years the experience of those evacuated from the Chernobyl exclusion zone in 1986. The same sudden displacement, the same official silence, the same prohibition on taking belongings that might carry contamination and thereby serve as evidence, and the same long aftermath of illness, legal dispute, and institutional denial. The Kishtim disaster was a rehearsal for Chernobyl, in the worst possible sense, a demonstration that the Soviet nuclear state had no functional mechanism for learning from its own catastrophes, because learning would have required acknowledging them. The Kishtim explosion was catastrophic, but it was not the last major release of radioactivity from the MIAC area. A decade later, in the spring of 1967, a different kind of disaster occurred. One that was not an accident in the conventional sense, but the predictable consequence of what had been done to Lake Karachay. The winter of 1966 to 1967 was unusually dry, and by spring the water level in Lake Karachay had dropped significantly, exposing the contaminated sediments along the lake's shoreline. Those sediments, packed with decades of deposited radioactive waste, dried out in the spring sun and wind, and the fine particles carrying strontium-90, cesium-137, and other radioactive isotopes became airborne. The wind carried them across a region of approximately 1,800 square kilometers, depositing radioactive dust on fields, villages, and waterways over an area that had been only partially contaminated by the Kishtim explosion a decade earlier. An estimated 500,000 people were exposed to the wind-blown contamination, and the event added another layer of radioactive deposition to a landscape that was already severely contaminated from the explosion and from years of river contamination. The 1967 event did not receive even the limited internal acknowledgement that the Kishtim explosion had eventually received within the Soviet system. It is less well documented, less studied, and less known, even among specialists in nuclear history, than the explosion of 1957. But in terms of the population exposed and the area contaminated, it was a major release in its own right, and it occurred 15 years into the period of Lake Karachay waste dumping, at a time when the lake's sediment contamination was already at extreme levels. The response to the 1967 event was a decision to reduce the risk of future wind-blown contamination by lowering the lake's shoreline exposure. This was accomplished by beginning to fill the lake, adding soil and material to raise the level of the contaminated sediments below the waterline. Over the following decades, this filling process would eventually become the major management strategy for the lake, though the goal was never remediation, never removal of the radioactive material, but simply the suppression of the most immediate pathways by which the contamination could spread. The distinction matters. Remediation would mean removing the contamination, processing it into a stable form, and disposing of it in a genuinely secure facility. What was done at Lake Karachay was containment, an imperfect containment at that, because the radioactive material in the sediments is in contact with groundwater that moves through the subsurface, and that groundwater does not respect the boundaries of the lake. Radioactive contamination has been detected in groundwater at distances of several kilometers from the lake, indicating that the containment is leaking, as it has been for decades, slowly extending the contamination into the surrounding aquifer. The 1967 wind event also illustrates a principle that applies to nuclear contamination everywhere it exists, that stored radioactive material does not stay stored without continuous active management. A lake whose level drops during a dry year Exposing contaminated sediments to wind demonstrates that passive containment is never truly passive. It requires the right weather, the right hydrology, the right conditions remaining constant, and the history of the world does not provide any guarantee that conditions will remain constant over the centuries required for the most dangerous isotopes to decay to safe levels. The problem of nuclear legacy is not solved by sealing it away. It is deferred, and deferral has its own costs. To understand why Lake Karachay is so dangerous, and why the contamination it has spread is so consequential, it helps to understand what radiation does to the human body at the cellular level, and why the particular isotopes concentrated at Mayak are especially harmful. Radiation, in the sense relevant here, refers to ionizing radiation, which is radiation energetic enough to knock electrons out of atoms, converting them into ions. When ionizing radiation passes through biological tissue, it does this to the atoms in the molecules that make up cells. And when those molecules are DNA, the ionization can break chemical bonds in the DNA strand, creating damage that the cell must repair, or that, if it cannot be repaired, will cause the cell to malfunction or die. A single ionizing event in a cell does not kill a person. The body has extensive repair mechanisms for DNA damage, and ordinary background radiation, from cosmic rays and naturally occurring radioactive minerals in the earth, creates a constant low level of ionizing events in every cell in the body, all day, every day. And the repair mechanisms handle this without difficulty. The problem arises when the rate of ionizing events exceeds the repair capacity of the cells, either because the dose is very high over a short period, as in acute radiation syndrome, or because a radioactive isotope has been incorporated into the body and is delivering continuous low-level radiation from the inside over months and years, gradually accumulating damage faster than it can be repaired. The second scenario, chronic internal exposure from incorporated isotopes, is the one relevant to the populations around Mayak. When strontium-90 is absorbed into bone, it sits there, in close proximity to the bone marrow where blood cells are produced, and delivers radiation at close range to the stem cells responsible for producing all the blood cells in the body. Those stem cells are among the most radiosensitive cells in the body, because they divide frequently, and are therefore most vulnerable to the kind of DNA damage that causes uncontrolled cell division, which is cancer. The specific cancers most strongly associated with strontium-90 exposure are leukemia, because of the proximity of strontium-90 in bone to the marrow that produces blood cells, and osteosarcoma, a bone cancer, for the same reason. Both have been found in elevated rates in populations around Mayak and along the Tekla River, documented in studies that have been conducted since the partial opening of Soviet archives in the late 1980s. The damage from ionizing radiation is also not limited to the person who is exposed. Radiation damage to the DNA of germ cells, the cells that produce eggs and sperm, can be passed to the next generation as mutations, and elevated rates of certain congenital conditions have been reported in the children and grandchildren of people who received high radiation doses from the Mayak operations. The contamination has consequences that extend across generations, because the cells it damages are not just the cells of the exposed person, but the genetic material that will be passed to their descendants. The concept of a dose is important here, because it is the foundation of all radiation protection standards, and because it is also a deeply impersonal way of describing something that, at the individual level, is anything but impersonal. A dose is a quantity of energy deposited in tissue, measured in units called Gray or sievert, and the relationship between dose and health outcome is statistical, rather than deterministic at low doses, meaning that a given dose does not guarantee a particular health outcome for a particular person, but raises the probability of certain outcomes across a population. For the people around Mayak, this statistical language translates into individual lives altered by cancer, into families bereaved, into children born with conditions they did not cause, and into communities that were changed by what was done to them, in ways that persist to this day. The Teka River flows north from the area around Mayak, and it carries with it a burden that no river should carry, one that was imposed on it beginning in the 1940s, and that has been documented, studied, and disputed ever since the first outside researchers were permitted to examine the evidence. The river was used from the very beginning of Mayak's operations as a secondary dumping ground for lower-level radioactive waste, in addition to the direct discharge to Lake Karachay for higher activity materials. Wastewater from the facility, containing dissolved radioactive isotopes at levels far above any safe standard, was released into the river continuously for years, and the river carried it north through a landscape dotted with small farming and fishing villages, whose residents had no idea what was in the water they drank, the fish they caught, and the floodplains where they grew their food. The Teka River contamination stretched approximately 240 kilometers downstream from the Mayak facility to where the river joins larger waterways, and the contamination becomes diluted enough to fall below detectable levels. Along those 240 kilometers, the riverside soil, the river sediments, and the groundwater adjacent to the river receive deposits of radioactive material that, in the most contaminated stretches near the facility, were comparable to the contamination levels found in the most affected areas around Chernobyl. The 28 villages that lined the most contaminated stretches of the river had a combined population of approximately 100,000 people in the early 1950s, and those people were the primary victims of the river contamination. They were not warned. They were not evacuated immediately. The first evacuations did not begin until 1951, several years after the contamination had begun, and even then the evacuations were partial, affecting only the villages closest to the facility, while communities farther downstream continued to drink from and fish in the contaminated river for years afterward. The health effects in the Teka River villages have been studied in what is now called the Teka River Cohort, a long-term epidemiological study of approximately 30,000 individuals who were exposed to the river contamination in the early 1950s. The study, begun in the 1960s when Soviet researchers began to be allowed to examine the health records of the exposed population, has produced extensive documentation of elevated rates of leukemia, solid tumors, and cardiovascular disease in the exposed population compared to unexposed controls, providing some of the most detailed human data available on the health effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure. The Teka River study is significant beyond its documentation of the Mayak victims, because the exposure occurred in a civilian population at relatively low but chronic dose rates, rather than in the extreme high dose rate scenarios of atomic bomb survivors. The Teka River data provides unique information about radiation health effects at the lower doses that are relevant to occupational and environmental standards. The people of the Teka River villages became, without their knowledge or consent, subjects of the most extensive involuntary human radiation experiment in history. The river continues to carry traces of contamination today, measurable at very low levels in its water and sediments even now, decades after the direct discharge from Mayak was curtailed. The legacy contamination in the river's sediment banks, where radioactive material was deposited during the years of heaviest discharge, releases small quantities into the water column through natural erosion and sediment disturbance, maintaining a low-level contamination signal that monitoring continues to detect. The river is not dangerous to cross or be near in the way it once was, but it is not clean either, and it will not be clean in any complete sense within the lifetime of anyone now living. The erasure of the Teka River villages was not metaphorical. It was physical, systematic, and documented in Soviet records that were not released until decades later. When the decision was made to evacuate the most contaminated villages, the evacuation was followed by demolition. Houses were torn down, fields were plowed under, and the physical evidence of human habitation was removed from the landscape. The purpose was not to clean the land, because the radioactive contamination in the soil could not be removed by demolition, but to remove the visible signs that people had once lived there, making it harder for anyone to ask why they had left or where they had gone. The residents who were evacuated were relocated to villages and towns in other parts of the Chelyabinsk region, given modest compensation that did not reflect the value of what they had lost, and told, in vague and bureaucratic language, that their former homes were now part of a restricted zone. They were not told about the radiation. They were not given health monitoring. They were not informed that the land they had lived on, the river they had drunk from, and the fish they had eaten for years had been contaminated with radioactive isotopes that were now incorporated into their bones and soft tissues, where they would continue to deliver radiation for the rest of their lives. Some evacuees returned to their former villages after the initial restrictions were relaxed, because the notifications about the restricted zone were not always enforced, and because people naturally want to return to familiar places. Those who returned found their houses gone, but the land still there, and some settled again in the area, unknowingly re-exposing themselves to the contaminated soil and whatever residual contamination remained in the groundwater. The authorities did not always act to prevent this, and in some cases the resettlement was permitted to continue for years before renewed restrictions were imposed. The physical erasure of contaminated villages is a pattern that appeared again after the Kishtim explosion of 1957, when additional communities in the path of the radioactive plume were evacuated and their structures demolished. The total number of villages and settlements that were erased from the landscape in the Mayak area over the decades of the facility's operation is difficult to establish precisely, because the records were classified and some have been lost, but estimates based on available documentation suggest that more than 20 communities were partially or fully demolished and their populations relocated. These communities have no memorial. There are no plaques where the houses stood, no monuments to the people who lived there, no public acknowledgement of what was done to them and why. The land is empty, officially part of a restricted zone that stretches across the most contaminated areas of the Mayak legacy, and the people who once lived on it have dispersed into the larger Russian population, their health outcomes tracked in classified databases and academic studies rather than honored in any public way. The erasure of these communities is a form of violence that is easy to overlook because it left no visible monuments of its own. The bombed city leaves ruins. The flood leaves mud and debris. The erased village leaves nothing. And the nothing is the point, because the nothing prevents questions, and the questions are the thing most feared by the institution responsible. What happened to the people who lived here? Why did they leave? What was in the river they drank from? The physical erasure was designed to ensure that those questions would never be asked, because there would be no visible evidence that anyone had ever been there to ask them about. The systematic suppression of information about the Mayak operations and their consequences lasted, in its most complete form, until the late 1980s. When the reformist policies of Mikhail Gorbachev's government created a limited opening for the acknowledgement of Soviet-era disasters that had previously been classified. The mechanisms of concealment were multiple and reinforcing. The secrecy surrounding Ozyorsk and the Mayak facility meant that the most direct evidence of what was happening, the facility's own records of waste disposal, radiation doses, and health outcomes of workers and residents, was accessible only to the people inside the system, who had every institutional incentive to suppress rather than disclose. The classification of medical records meant that the doctors treating patients in the affected areas could not legally discuss the causes of the conditions they were seeing, even with their patients. The assignment of radiation-related illness to other causes in official medical records was a deliberate practice, not an error of diagnosis. Leukemia cases were recorded as anemia or other blood disorders. Bone cancers were attributed to other causes. The cumulative effect was that the epidemiological signal from the MIAC operations was systematically obscured in the official data, making it impossible for outside researchers, had they been allowed access, to identify the radiation source from the medical records alone. The international scientific community's initial dismissal of George Medvedev's account of the Kyshtym disaster in 1976 was partly the result of the genuinely secret nature of the information, and partly the result of institutional reluctance within the Western nuclear establishment to acknowledge that a disaster of such magnitude was possible, because acknowledging it would have raised uncomfortable questions about the safety of nuclear facilities everywhere. The British government's official denial, citing the implausibility of Medvedev's account, was later shown to have been made despite classified knowledge within the British nuclear establishment that a major accident had indeed occurred. When the Soviet archives began to open in the late 1980s, the scale of what had been concealed became apparent. The Kyshtym explosion was confirmed. The Teka River contamination was confirmed. The health data from exposed workers and communities, accumulated over decades by Soviet researchers who had been conducting classified studies, was gradually made available to international scientists, and the Teka River cohort study was established as a joint Russian-American international research effort to analyze the health consequences of the exposures. The opening was never complete. Significant portions of the MIAC archives remain classified in the Russian Federation today. The full scope of the waste disposal, the full extent of the contamination, and the full accounting of health consequences have not been made public, and some of the most important data, particularly dosimetry records for early workers who received the highest exposures, may have been lost or destroyed during the Soviet period. What is known is enough to establish the outline of what happened. What remains unknown may never be fully recovered. The cover-up also reveals something about institutional psychology that is not unique to the Soviet Union. Organizations that have made decisions with catastrophic consequences have a powerful structural incentive to suppress evidence of those consequences, because the evidence is also evidence of the decision, and the decision implicates the people who made it. The suppression of information about MIAC was not irrational from the perspective of the institution. It was the logical extension of the same priorities that had motivated the original decision to dump into the lake, the protection of the program above all other considerations. The people who maintained the cover-up were not all cynical operatives indifferent to human suffering. Many were ordinary bureaucrats and scientists following the institutional norms of a system that had been designed, from the very beginning, to treat information about the weapons program as a national security matter of the highest importance. Within that framework, disclosing the health consequences of the program was not just professionally dangerous, but could be understood, sincerely, as a betrayal of the state's security interests. The cover-up was sustained not only by fear but by the genuine belief, held by at least some of its participants, that secrecy was necessary, and that the costs being imposed on the affected populations were an acceptable price for national security. Whether those beliefs were correct, and whether that framework of reasoning can justify what was done, are questions that history has answered, though the people who participated in the cover-up are not all available to account for their choices. The story of how the outside world came to know about Lake Karachay and the MIAC contamination is itself a story about the difficulty of establishing truth in the face of deliberate suppression, and about the persistence of individual scientists who refuse to accept official denials at face value. George Medvedev was the first to break the story internationally, but he was not working alone. Inside the Soviet Union, a small number of researchers had been conducting classified studies of the contaminated populations since the 1960s, accumulating health data on the Teka River cohort and on the workers of MIAC in studies that were rigorously conducted by the standards of the time, but whose findings were restricted to internal circulation. These researchers knew, from their own data, what the exposures had done to the populations they were studying. They could not publish it, They could not discuss it publicly, but the knowledge existed within the system, held by people who understood its significance, even if they could not act on it. Outside the Soviet Union, researchers who worked on radiation effects in other contexts were aware that the Ural Mountains region had been the site of some kind of nuclear incident, because Medvedev's account and subsequent corroborating reports had established that much. What they could not do was access the Soviet data directly, because the Soviet archives were closed, and the researchers inside the system were not permitted to share their findings. The partial opening that began under Gorbachev and accelerated in the 1990s enabled the first genuine international collaboration on the MAYAC data. American researchers from the Department of Energy's national laboratories, Scandinavian researchers with expertise in radiation epidemiology, and scientists from other countries worked alongside Russian colleagues to begin analyzing the decades of accumulated health data from the affected populations. The work produced a series of major publications in international peer-reviewed journals beginning in the late 1990s, documenting the health effects with a rigor and transparency that the original Soviet studies, however carefully conducted, had never been able to achieve because of the secrecy surrounding them. These publications were significant, not only for what they revealed about the MAYAC operations, but for the scientific knowledge they contributed to understanding radiation health effects at the dose levels relevant to environmental and occupational exposure. The Tetra River data, in particular, filled a gap in the scientific understanding of chronic low-dose rate exposure that neither atomic bomb survivor data, which involved extremely high doses delivered instantaneously, nor occupational data from nuclear industries, which involved lower doses but less precise exposure records, could adequately address. The scientists who conducted this work, both the Soviet researchers who had maintained the data under classification for decades, and the international collaborators who helped analyze and publish it, performed a service that extends well beyond the documentation of a historical injustice. They turned a catastrophe into knowledge, and that knowledge has influenced radiation protection standards and the scientific understanding of radiation risk in ways that affect nuclear safety regulation around the world today. The legacy of the MAYAC scientists who maintained classified health records under conditions where the institutional pressure was overwhelmingly toward suppression is worth acknowledging directly. These were researchers who understood what they were seeing in the health data of the exposed populations, who documented it carefully and preserved the documentation despite its sensitive nature, and who did this work knowing that they could not publish it, could not discuss it with colleagues outside the system, and could not act on it in ways that would have made the most obvious immediate difference, which was warning and treating the people in the affected communities. They did what they could do within the constraints they faced, and the data they preserved became, decades later, the basis for some of the most important epidemiological research in the history of radiation science. Lake Karachay is sometimes described as a dead lake, a place where life cannot exist because the radiation levels are too high for biological processes to function. This is not entirely accurate, and the ways in which it is inaccurate are scientifically interesting. The lake does support life, in a sense, though not the kind of lake life you would find in an uncontaminated body of water. Certain microorganisms, particularly bacteria and archaea, have evolved resistance to ionizing radiation that far exceeds the tolerance of any complex organism. And these radiation-resistant microbes have been found living in the sediments of Lake Karachay and in other heavily contaminated environments around the MAYAC facility. The most famous radiation-resistant organism, a bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans, has been found in environments with radiation levels that would be instantly lethal to any vertebrate, and its extraordinary resistance to DNA damage has made it a subject of intense scientific interest. The microorganisms living in and around Lake Karachay are not thriving in any ordinary ecological sense, but they are present and active, and they are contributing to the chemical cycling of the radioactive isotopes in the lake sediments in ways that are not fully understood. Microbial activity can change the chemical form of radioactive elements, converting them between forms that are tightly bound to sediment particles and forms that are more soluble and mobile. And this has implications for the leaching of radioactive material into groundwater. Whether the microbial activity in Lake Karachay's sediments is on balance making the contamination more or less mobile is a question that researchers have studied but not definitively answered. Larger organisms are effectively absent from the lake proper because the radiation levels in the water and sediments are too high for fish, invertebrates, or aquatic plants to survive. The zone immediately around the lake is part of a restricted area, and monitoring of wildlife in the broader Mayak region has documented elevated rates of genetic abnormalities in small mammals and birds that inhabit the most contaminated zones, similar to findings in the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. The landscape around Lake Karachay has a quality that researchers who have worked there describe in terms that are consistently unsettling. It looks, from a distance, like ordinary Russian countryside, the kind of gentle rolling terrain dotted with birch and pine forest that covers much of the interior of the country. The contamination that makes it deadly is invisible. There is no glow, no visible sign of the radiation fields that would kill a person in an hour. The silence is the silence of an ecosystem that has been disrupted in ways that are not immediately apparent to the eye. And the emptiness is the emptiness of human absence from a place that once held human communities, imposed not by the harshness of the landscape, but by what people put into it. The invisibility of radiation is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of the Mayak legacy. A contaminated river looks like any river. Contaminated soil looks like any soil. The birch forest near the lake looks like birch forest anywhere in Russia. There is no sensory cue available to a person standing in the restricted zone that would alert them to the danger, unless they carried a Geiger counter. And the early residents of the Teka River villages had no such instruments. They encountered the contamination through its effects on their bodies, months or years after the exposure, by which time the damage was already done and already spreading through the tissues that absorbed the radioactive isotopes. The decision to fill Lake Karachay, rather than remediate it, was not made in a single moment, but evolved over decades of management decisions driven by the balance between what was technically feasible, what was financially possible, and what the Russian nuclear authorities were willing to commit to. The filling began in the 1970s, following the 1967 wind dispersal event, with the addition of soil and crushed rock to raise the water level and submerge the exposed contaminated shoreline. This was effective in the immediate sense of reducing the wind-blown dispersal pathway, but it did not address the sediment contamination or the groundwater leaching that were the other major pathways by which the radioactive material in the lake continued to spread. Over the following decades, the filling was expanded, and by the early 2000s the lake had been substantially reduced in surface area through the addition of large amounts of fill material, including hollow concrete blocks designed to displace water volume without adding excessive weight to the contaminated sediments below. The goal was to completely cover the lake with concrete and rock fill, pressing the contaminated sediments under a cap of inert material that would reduce the mobility of the radioactive isotopes. This work was largely completed by around 2015, when the surface of what had been Lake Karachay was covered by a concrete and rock cap that extended across the full area of the former lake. From above, the site now appears as a roughly flat area of concrete and fill, unremarkable from the air, with no indication that below it lie sediments containing the equivalent of multiple Chernobyl disasters worth of radioactivity. The word remediation is not appropriate for what was done. Remediation implies the removal or neutralization of contamination, returning a site to a condition where it no longer poses a hazard. The Lake Karachay project did neither. The radioactive material is still there, in the same quantity it was in before the filling. And it will remain radioactive for decades to centuries, depending on the specific isotopes and their half-lives. What the concrete cap does is suppress the most immediate pathways of exposure and dispersal, reducing the rate at which the contamination spreads into the surrounding environment. Whether it succeeds in this limited goal is uncertain. The groundwater contamination that has been documented around the site is evidence that the concrete cap cannot stop the movement of radioactive material through the subsurface, because groundwater moves through rock and soil in ways that a surface cap cannot prevent. The contamination plume in the groundwater around Lake Karachay is estimated to be moving slowly but continuously outward, and it has already reached distances of several kilometers from the lake in some directions. Whether it will eventually reach the larger river systems and population centers that depend on that groundwater is a question that hydrogeologists and radiation protection authorities monitor, but cannot definitively answer. The monitoring continues, and will need to continue for longer than any institution has ever maintained a continuous program of environmental surveillance. The half-life of strontium-90 is 29 years, meaning that the contamination in the sediments will be reduced to half its current level in roughly 3 decades, to a quarter in 6 decades, to an eighth in 9 decades. But the original contamination levels are so extreme that even 10 half-lives, nearly 300 years, will leave residual radioactivity well above natural background levels. Whoever is responsible for the southern Ural region 300 years from now will still be managing the legacy of decisions made in the 1950s by people whose names they may not know, for reasons they may find difficult to fully comprehend. The concrete lid is a statement about what is possible given the constraints of money, technology, and political will. It is not a solution. It is a postponement, a transfer of the problem from the present to the future, and the future it is transferred to extends well beyond the planning horizon of any government or institution currently responsible for the site. The 1967 wind event also illustrates a principle that applies to nuclear contamination everywhere it exists. That stored radioactive material does not stay stored without continuous active management. A lake whose level drops during a dry year, exposing contaminated sediments to wind, demonstrates that passive containment is never truly passive. It requires the right weather, the right hydrology, the right conditions remaining constant, and the history of the world does not provide any guarantee that conditions will remain constant over the centuries required for the most dangerous isotopes to decay to safe levels. The problem of nuclear legacy is not solved by sealing it away. It is deferred, and deferral has its own costs. Lake Karachay did not happen in isolation. It happened because of specific decisions made under specific pressures in a specific historical context, and understanding those decisions, and what made them possible, is essential to understanding what the story of Lake Karachay means for the world beyond the Ural Mountains. The decisions were made possible by secrecy, and the secrecy was made possible by the particular nature of the Soviet state, which was capable of constructing an entire city, an entire industrial complex, an entire catastrophic legacy of environmental contamination, and keeping it hidden from its own population and from the world for decades. No democracy with a free press and independent regulatory institutions would have been able to maintain that level of concealment, because the mechanisms of accountability that democracies possess, imperfect as they are, would have forced some degree of disclosure long before the damage reached the scale it reached at Mayak. This is not to say that democracies are immune to nuclear secrecy or nuclear mismanagement. The history of nuclear programs in the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and other countries contains episodes of concealment, of exposure of workers and communities without adequate disclosure, of regulatory failures and institutional cover-ups. The Hanford site in Washington state, the nuclear production facility that played a role in the American weapons program analogous to Mayak's in the Soviet program, has a legacy of radioactive contamination that is still being managed and will require active remediation work for decades to come. The Rocky Flats facility in Colorado, the Nevada test site, the Marshall Islands, where American nuclear tests contaminated inhabited atolls, all tell parts of a story about the relationship between nuclear power and human consequences that is not unique to the Soviet Union. But the scale of what happened at Mayak, the completeness of the concealment, and the duration over which the concealment was maintained, make it an extreme case, a demonstration of what becomes possible when industrial power operates entirely without accountability, when the people affected by an activity have no way to know what is happening to them, no recourse to any institution that might intervene on their behalf, and no language in which to demand an explanation for what they are experiencing. The people of the Teka River villages, the workers of Ozyorsk, the communities in the path of the Kishtim explosion, did not choose to be part of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. They did not consent to be contaminated. They did not know they were being poisoned, and they had no way to find out, because the information was classified at the highest levels of the Soviet state, and the doctors who might have told them were themselves constrained by the same classification. They were, in the most complete sense, subjects rather than citizens, acted upon by a state that regarded their welfare as secondary to the imperatives of the weapons program. As you lie in the dark tonight, the lake still exists. The concrete cap is in place, pressing down on sediments that will remain radioactive for another century or more. The groundwater contamination plume continues to move, slowly, through the aquifer below the southern Ural foothills. The Teka River carries traces of contamination that are now measured in fractions of safe limits rather than multiples, but that are still present, still monitored, still the legacy of decisions made before anyone now living was born. The story of Lake Karachay is, in the end, a story about what we leave behind, about the kinds of problems that cannot be solved within a single lifetime or a single generation, about the responsibilities that industrial civilization creates and then tries to conceal, and about the persistence of consequences that outlast the intentions, the institutions, and even the nations that created them. Sleep well. The world you wake to tomorrow is the product of choices made long before you arrived in it, and the choices made today will shape a world that people not yet born will have to live in. The silence of Lake Karachay endures. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a thing that cannot speak, that has been sealed and covered and pressed down, waiting with all the patience of physics for the time when someone or something will have to reckon with what lies beneath.